Welcome to today's archaeology lecture. This is the fourth in 4 lectures about archaeology at Marble Hill. And we're delighted to see so many of you here to discover a bit more about our history at Marble Hill. As many of you will know, Marble Hill is being revived, and that will see a number of exciting things for our community. The first being our house open free 5 days a week, and it's being reinterpreted, so it will be a feast for the senses. And the other area is with our sports provisions. We're doing a number of the sports pitches at the moment, and there'll be a fully accessible changing facility on site, which we're really excited about. Another way in which we're exploring our Revive project is by offering a lovely cafe. So every time you have a cup of coffee, you'll be able to give back to the park and to our house and to our site indeed. And that will be open, we hope, as soon as possible as lockdown finishes. So we are in the process of getting that open as soon as possible for you. And another way in which we're investing in the site is through the landscape. And that is by really opening up the areas, ensuring that we're planting for a really diverse and biosecure space. And of course, we're kind of reconstructing some of the historic elements. And Thomas has been very important in being able to understand a little bit more about our heritage. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Thomas Cromwell. He's been our lead archaeologist on site and has performed a number of different digs, and we're really looking forward to having him back to do the Grotto in the summer. And it's been a real delight to work with him at Marble Hill, and we look forward to doing so again. But tonight we're going to be talking about our landscape and the areas in which he's been exploring over the past few months. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Thomas Cromwell to take the stage.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction. My name's Tom, as you know, and I work for Historic England, and we've been involved with this project for the past four and a half years or so, since before it became a lottery-funded bid. And for those of you who have been to the previous sections, the next couple of slides might be a bit repetition, but for anyone who hasn't been, just in case, to bring you up to speed, Historic England works hand in hand sometimes with English Heritage. We used to be one organization, and we often get called upon to provide some expert services in terms of understanding the sites that English Heritage controls. And Marble Hill is a classic one. For those who don't know the site, this is Marble Hill from the air. The site is pretty much the full extent of the gardens by the time Henrietta Howard had died. Although she didn't buy the whole site to start with, it grew over time. The house is in the middle here. Areas that we've been involved in researching on behalf of English Heritage include the ice house, the 9-pin alley, the arbours that bracket the woodlands, that bracket the main lawn, and of course the grotto, where we have done some work, but we're going to come back and do some more later in the summer. Again, delayed, unfortunately, because of COVID, etc. Right, so it all starts with this map, which is variously dated from 1748 to 1752, depending on who you ask and when you've asked them over the last few years. What we do know is it's a map of the full extent of Henrietta Howard's estate. We know it was drawn by the surveyor of the Duke of Argyll because his cartouche is in the top corner there, and it says that it's drawn for the Duke of Argyll. He was a trustee of Henrietta Howard's estate because her personal affairs and her financial affairs are the subject of many a lecture that aren't going to happen here. But as a result, he was quite heavily involved in her tenure of this site. And round about the time this was drawn, the estate, that there was a land purchase issue going on. And we believe this to be a map of the site as it was found at the time, with the extra lands that were being added to it. And you'll note that the center lower portion is the only bit that has any significant detail, the formal gardens, essentially. The other areas are shown mainly as field and were added along the way. If we zoom in on the formal gardens, because that's the area of greatest interest to us for this project, when the land was first purchased, the area to the north that now has the cricket pitch wasn't part of the deal. So the entire garden effectively looked south toward the river rather than north toward the road as we now know it. So we have the house at the top middle. We have the ice house in the top left that I talked about back in December, the 9-pin alley down in the lower left, which I talked about in January. We have an orangery in the top right, and down the bottom right, we have the grotto, the famous grotto for this site. And in the middle, we have a lawn bracketed by 4 segments of curving, what looks like some sort of covered walkway or archway. So if we look at those, oh, sorry, jumped ahead. If we look at those, that's the area that we're now calling the arbor. They were being called pergolas at one point in time, but we've now settled on the term arbor, and we were hoping to find some sort of evidence of their existence and their nature. Now, when the site was first laid out, we know that Alexander Pope, who was a good friend of Henrietta Howard, was quite heavily involved, as was Charles Bridgman, who was essentially garden designer to the king. And we have this plan, which is attributed to Pope. We know from correspondence he was quite heavily involved in designing it in the mid 1720s. And this is considered to be his plan of the site. I'm a little concerned about that attribution personally, because it seems a bit too formal and a bit too rigid from what we know of Pope's style of garden design. It certainly has the very serpentine sort of pathways and wilderness quarters on the right-hand side that we know from the later 1749 plan, and which are more what we would expect of Pope. But some of the more rigid areas of design don't really ring true to me, and I'm wondering how much of Bridgman is in this as opposed to Pope. But if we zoom in on the central portion, Pope's intention was always that there should be a lawn in front of the house on which one could play bowls, and he does describe in some detail his views on how that should be laid out, the view of the sun and shadow, etc. So we have a rectangular area here with what looks to be sort of a gravel path indicated by brown coloring around the edges of it. And then either side of that are these 2 semicircular parterres, which are very structured for something from Pope. They aren't unusual for the period or for the period beforehand, to be honest, but aren't as naturalized as I would like them to be if they were actually Pope's hand. And either side of that, we have what look like archways sort of drawn in isometric, as was a common way of depicting structure on these sorts of plans of this period. And they seem to lead into an area of basically a crescent of woodland or trees of some sort with presumably a path through them, similar to the arbor that we see in the 1749 plan. And that seems to be the boundary between the lawn and its crescent-shaped formal gardens, and then the wilderness area off to the right and the small bit of wilderness on the left before it runs into other structure. So we have the genesis of what we see in the later plans, and almost certainly Pope's influence carries through to what actually does get built, even though large chunks of this early plan don't actually happen in the end. And the thing that worries me about it being attributed to Pope necessarily is if we look at the plan of his own garden, as published in the 1750s by John Searle, we don't see much in the way of formal structure of raised beds and basically things that look suspiciously 17th or even 16th century in design. It is much more about open space and large plantings to form light and shadow, to create compartments so that the garden appears bigger than it really is. And that would be a particular issue, obviously, at Marble Hill with the garden, isn't all that big by sort of country garden standards, and you would have to make some effort to try and divide it up and make it more entertaining to walk through by blocking off the visual sort of range to it. So if we go back to our plan, what we see in the 1740s flourishing, which is almost preserved in what we now have, we see that a lot of the more rigid formal material in that early plan isn't here. We've got serpentine paths and we've got lots of sort of planting, but not much in the way of structured beds. And if we zoom in on the area of the lawn and our pergolas, we notice that the pergola structures themselves appear to be some sort of arches with something growing across the top, presumably. I was originally of the opinion they might represent some sort of planted trees that are knitted together, but it doesn't look like that the more I squint at it. Unfortunately, it looks suspiciously like some sort of posts driven into the ground, which of course are going to be a bit difficult to see in the archaeology. But it does look like it has some sort of path through it. However, this is where things get complicated. We see in this 1890 auction map of the estate that most of that structure is gone. We have the lawn, we have some trees in roughly the right place for the woodland quarters as we now know them. What we don't have is any formal crescent-shaped edging to it, and it looks like it's lawn all the way across from side to side, rather than the jungle that we had up until October of last year. So where the formal planting in the 1740s is gone is anyone's guess, but it does look suspiciously as if the whole lot was taken out and laid to turf at some point. Okay, so we know there's heavy work going on this site. And when we look at the first edition Ordnance Survey Map, which is surveyed in at the end of the 19th century, about the same sort of time as the Sale map, we see a few more trees to it. It's a bit more wilderness in the areas that we had as woodland quarters, but again, there doesn't seem to be much structure. So the 19th century hasn't been terribly favorable, shall we say, to the 1740s design. We opened a trench across the pergola, or arbor, as it might be called, and unfortunately, what we found is that we came down straight through the topsoil, which is mostly sort of decayed organic matter, straight down onto brick earth, the orange natural silty soil in this area. We didn't come down onto anything that had any gravel in it, so we were a bit concerned about how the paths were made up. We also didn't see much in the way of structure in terms of posts and indication of rows of anything to form the arbor structure. What we did find was a lot of tree roots from the last 120 or so years where this has been allowed to run riot as a woodland area safely tucked away behind chestnut paling. And that's obscured our ability to see features in the ground. However, we did actually find a feature as circled here. And when we excavated it, it did seem that it was going to be a pit that could be a post hole or a planting pit, until we got to the bottom and found a sweetie wrapper. And this feature is certainly no more than about 40 years old. Now, the site unfortunately does suffer quite a bit from burrowing animals. So the area has been subject to a certain amount of tunneling in recent years. And we, short of tearing down all of the trees here, including that nice big one in the corner of the photo, and causing untold damage, there's no way we could strip it back enough to properly see anything as ephemeral as pairs of posts running across where the arbor should be, especially if there's no path under them. If instead it was simply turfed or left as exposed soil rather than any form of structure. We know that the gardener for the site had a contract that included him paying for all the gravel that was used to landscape the site, And we know from a number of trenches that we've dug here that gravel seems to be conspicuous by its absence almost everywhere we look for it, which suggests that the gardener obviously wasn't going to spend very much of his salary on gravel if he could avoid it. One thing that we did get, and if I point out these two pegs that I've just circled, are where independently the surveyors for the project have laid out where the arbor should go based on the 1749 map, just to indicate that we are sort of slap bang in the middle of it in this photo. One thing that we did get, because of the way they've cleared this site for the first time in living memory, is a chance to actually see all of the topography in this woodland quarter. And we took advantage of that and carried out a topographic survey, marching along and every few paces taking another height reading, mapping it all out and creating a contour plan. And as with most contour plans, the more bunched up the contours are, the greater the slope going on. You'll notice the lawn where the meter scale is has almost nothing in the way of contours because it's flat. And then we get other areas that are considerably more contoured. What we do get is this raised area here, which runs along where one arm of the arbor should be. And we get a steep slope running down from it that the badgers took advantage of, which drops about a meter or so from the high ground down to where the 9-pin alley is, and corresponds, unfortunately, with the terracing of the site. So they've made the best of a natural feature. And then we have a corresponding but slightly harder to see area of raised ground where the other arm of the arbor should be on this side. And again, the ground drops away from it toward the west, but is relatively flat out onto the lawn. So the topographic information suggests very strongly that that's where we should find these arbors, and that it was done for a reason, to create these lobes of the lawn coming out either side. So I'm reasonably happy that there should be an arbor there, but that it hasn't left us any good physical evidence because of the nature of how it was constructed. And we can reinforce that because this isn't the first time we've gone around this particular circle. If we look at this trench here from 2017, this is our trench 12. It was also designed to cut across the arbor on the diagonally opposite side of the lawn, the only area that was available to us at that time, again because of tree preservation and wildlife issues. And when we dug that trench, again, we didn't find any evidence of any sort of made ground, no gravel, no sand, no path makeup that we would like to see. And we did go down to natural at the very top end of this photo. It's hard to make out from this particular view, but at the very top end of that, the trench drops down onto the natural gravel terrace that underlies all of the brick earth on this site, and therefore takes us back at least into the medieval or probably prehistory, simply because of the way the brick earth builds up over time with every flooding episode and with windblown material in the dry season. And we don't have any paths happening in here, despite the fact that we crossed the line of where it should be. The only thing we did have was the footings of a glass house, a greenhouse, effectively. These brick footings with a very nice little drain in the corner, which puzzled us until, of course, we had another hard look at the first edition Ordinance Survey, where this greenhouse actually appears as a structure. Unfortunately, that's the first and the last time that that greenhouse seems to appear in any form of documentation whatsoever. The other thing that does show in this map is the remnants at the bottom, on the middle terrace, shall we say, between the 9-pin alley on the left and the grotto on the right. This is the remnants of what had been built as an Italian garden at some point in the 19th century. And if we look at this air photo with some geophysics data superimposed on it down the bottom, those orange squiggles, it was composed of a series of rectangular sort of compartments with circular things in them. And they were substantial enough, so it's down here, but they were substantial enough that when we trenched down the side of the terraces over towards the grotto, which is sort of at the back end of this photo, that sort of pile of broken earth that you can see. When we trenched through here, we found a dark feature that is most of the section in this trench underneath the red and white striped 2-meter ranging rod, which is part of one of those circular beds. So we have later activity in the gardens after Henrietta Howard's time. We also, however, if we go slightly further down the slope in one of the other trenches, the grotto is now sort of off to the top left corner of this slide, and we're looking east. We have a number of features in this trench down at the bottom of the brick earth that appear to be shallow ditches, possibly field boundaries, drainage ditches, that sort of thing, and various stake holes and what might be post holes or pits, some of which we reckon are immediately pre-18th century, so post-medieval, some of which we think are medieval, and some of which we think are probably much earlier than that, because there will have been people exploiting this riverside for hundreds or even thousands of years, with the brick earth slowly building up and sealing their activity as time goes by. Unfortunately, large chunks of it have absolutely nothing datable within it, so we can only surmise how old it is. And because of the nature of our narrow trenching to answer specific research questions on behalf of English Heritage to inform their project, we haven't been able to open up large swathes of the garden in order just to explore the prehistory and see how it all lays out in plan. That would be very destructive, but very informative. Unfortunately, it's not really called for at the moment, so that archaeology will sit there and wait until a future date. And talking about prehistory, AOC Archaeology, who are currently running the watching brief on site for all of the construction works, got in touch with me the other day because as part of the work near the 9-pin alley, they found at the very bottom of the brick earth, where it sits on top of the natural river gravels, a dark feature that looks suspiciously burnt and full of burnt flints. And it's where that red and white stick is. That's the half-meter scale. So it gives you an idea of how far down it is. That's about a meter and a bit's worth of soil above it. And they took a sample out of the feature, and we're hoping that there may be something in it, some organic material that might lend itself to carbon-14 dating. Unfortunately, this is breaking news, so it's early days yet, and we don't know what the results of that are going to be. But it reinforces the fact that this area has been in use for a very long time before Henrietta Howard came along. All right, so the next installment of this, of course, is going to be after we come back in August to excavate at the Grotto, to take that back to its full size, because we know that the 1980s reconstruction that we see now is only a fraction of the size of the hole that the Grotto originally occupied. And we'll continue then.
Thank you, Thomas, for that really informative talk. It's great to understand a bit more about the site, but also to look at other people who may have been part of the site's history. And thank you to everyone for joining us to hear Thomas today. I urge you to ask questions, and you can do that by going to the chat function at the bottom of your screen, which looks like a little speech bubble, and you can ask lots of questions, and I will hopefully pose those as best I can for Thomas. We've got one already in, and it's around that most recent finding. What would you hope that it would show?
Well, I'm hoping that there'll be something datable in it, and that it'll give us a date far enough back in the past to give us an idea of, well, when the accumulation of brick earth might have started. I mean, the difficulty we have in this area is that we know it's a post-glacial process, but we can't really pin down anything to it. We had, when we excavated the initial trench over the 9-pin alley back in 2017, we put a small box section down about 1/2 to 3/4 of a meter into the brick earth. And we found at various points within that ceramics and material that indicated sort of 17th, 16th, maybe even 15th century occupation. Unfortunately, because of the way the brick earth rots down effectively to become homogeneous. We didn't have horizons. It's not like you could peel it off to a ground surface at any fixed date, but we had essentially features floating within the brick earth. So as they deposit and more brick earth piles on top of them, they simply get fossilized within the soil profile. But we don't know how far back that goes in terms of history, or what people were doing with this landscape at any point in the past. We know immediately prior to Henrietta Howard buying the land that it was a combination of market gardens and water meadows, for want of any other way to deal with a river that floods occasionally, rather than a built-up area. But it'd be interesting to know more about that. Unfortunately, we'd have to peel back quite a lot of it. But we're hoping that that feature that AOC has just found might give us a start for when things start building up on top of the gravels. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed we find out a little bit more, because it'll be fascinating to understand that history. I think it's the joys of archaeology, isn't it? You're peeling back those layers.
Yeah, and you only get to find what's there, unfortunately.
Yeah. And that leads me on to another question, because there's sort of the archaeology really isn't terribly conclusive for the landscape. How would you respond to that?
Archaeology often isn't terribly conclusive. It's the nature of it. What we find is what's left behind. So activities that don't leave anything in the soil can't be found. And in an area where the soil might be disturbed by later activities, you can lose things as well. My concern is, given what we know about the finances of Henrietta Howard, and like I say, that's a whole lecture in and of itself. I have a feeling that a lot of the features on this site were incredibly ephemeral. She wasn't building for posterity. They weren't monumental structures being made of brick and stone. A lot of it, I think, was Georgian pastiche. Fairly simple, lightweight timber structures, suitably treated and clad such that they would probably survive for dozens of years before they had to be taken out and replaced, which conveniently might be when fashions change and you decide you don't really want that thing anyway. So out it comes just as it's starting to rot away, in the same way that we replace garden sheds. You buy a shed and you expect to get a dozen years out of it. If you get more, you're lucky, but chances are you'll replace it in that time anyway. And I think a lot of the features that we're looking for on that map are in that class of ephemera. And as I say, I don't think there was a whole lot of gravel being used out of the gardener's contract.
Because that would have been taken out of his salary. Is
exactly.
That correct?
He'd be paying for it, yes. It was up to him to buy it in. Now, initially, when the house is built, of course, the landscape has gravel under it, and the house and the basements for the adjacent service wing that's now gone would have dug out quite a lot of gravel. And I suspect that is what went into the pathway that runs across the south face of the house. Because when they dug the tree pits there in November, they were finding gravel underneath the tarmac that we now see. And it's quite a substantial wodge of gravel. It's the best part of a foot thick. And I suspect that's prior to the gardener's contract, and is to do with the builders having lots of gravel and putting that down as part of the initial construction of the house and gardens. But thereafter, when it became the gardener's job to source gravel, he couldn't dig it out of the landscape, because that would obviously leave a big hole. He'd have to buy it in from a builder's merchant somewhere in the neighborhood, and that would come out of his pocket.
So why do it? I guess would be his point.
Unfortunately, we can't go back in time to see this happening, but we can surmise that he was probably a bit tight on the use of any gravel anywhere.
Absolutely. I mean, we're so lucky to have this lottery heritage grant to be able to share about this project and to work with Historic England, but also to work with other partners. Can you tell me about your links with AOC and how they are part of the project?
Right. Well, AOC, because they're based locally, literally a 5-minute walk from the site, which is very convenient. They have local knowledge. They are available as a commercial unit to basically arrive the next day if you pick up the phone. There are a lot of advantages to where they are. And where we've found the need to basically source extra labor on site, it's been quite convenient to be able to get hold of AOC and say, would you mind coming out and, you know, lending us a handful of people for X amount of time? They've also been the perfect people, considering where they are and what they know about the neighborhood, to pick up on the development side of the project. Historic England is doing research, so we're looking at bigger questions that are being posed by the development team. But the actual monitoring of construction, the recording of any archaeology that gets exposed during that, is actually let out as a commercial tender. We're not taking that work away from the private sector, you know, the commercial sector, because that would be wrong of us to work in that fashion. So AOC are the perfect people to give that job to. And I actually wrote a brief for them to do that work as part of the works that are going on at the moment. So as and when they dig tree planting holes or do any work in the house, for example, where they've been stripping off plaster or anything like that, they then get AOC in to look at what's been exposed and record it, with the idea that that will then become part of the publicly available archaeological record for Marble Hill. And we'll try to integrate as much of that information in our own studies when we finally get around to publishing what we've done, which won't come until after, obviously, we've finished, you know, with the grotto and everything else.
Absolutely. I think it's really lovely that we're able to use a very local firm to be able to be part of this project, as we're trying to do that across a number of different avenues. And it's lovely to have them on site, and also to be able to be there at a moment's notice if something is found from the tree pits or things like that.
Yeah, and it's the local knowledge really that they will build up because of where they're based that is invaluable.
Absolutely. I think there's another question around something that I know would be music to your ears, but for us locals, perhaps might not be so joyful. Do you think a trench across the whole site might be more revealing rather than separate trenches? You know what I'm going to say about this, Thomas.
Well, we would, yeah, from an academic standpoint, we would love to be able to open up huge swathes of the site and spend months and months, which is what it would take, with dozens of people digging it, recording it, and understanding it. However, that's hideously expensive and incredibly destructive. And we don't want to disrupt the site if we don't need to. So we try to target our investigations as best we can, just to answer the questions that have been raised. So the trenches down the terraces near the grotto, for example, were aimed at understanding the landform. Are those terraces part of the original 18th century design? Have they been modified, etc.? So we dug what we thought to be the smallest amount of archaeology to answer that question properly. And it's the same with everything else that we've done. We did a series of trenches around the outskirts of the grotto to try and work out the footprint of it based on the geophysical surveys that we'd had. So we start with non-destructive techniques, landscape investigation, looking at parch marks from aerial photography, geophysics, etc. And we only then go in to look at excavating if there are questions about things that can't be addressed through those non-destructive techniques. But we would love to if we could.
I think as a local and someone who's thinking about our ecology as well as our public park, and you know, kind of, it's lovely to have you on site doing those little bits and understanding a bit more. But it is I think a big trench across the whole of the site might be a little bit of a problem.
We are incredibly mindful of how much inconvenience we cause every time we fence off another chunk of the park. It's always a balancing act, and we try to do the minimum we need to try and answer the questions we've got.
Absolutely, and we're always loving having you there, Thomas. Another question we've got is about, is there any evidence on the nature of the big lawn terraces between the bowling lawn and the river? You know, kind of, were they sharp, crisp, steeper, gently rolling, or can you not tell it now?
Well, this is the interesting question that we were posed, and the reason why we dug that row of trenches down toward the river through each of basically the changes of slope of each of the terrace, so each of the crests as we went down. And by and large, we don't think they've altered very much at all since the 18th century. We know that the Italian garden was inserted into it, but we don't think they actually tinkered much with the shape or the edges of them. And I don't think they were much sharper than they are. They certainly don't appear much sharper in any of the views that have been sketched from the Thames, for example. Yeah, contemporary views in the 18th century. I think it always would have rolled down into the Thames. I think that in itself is probably something to do with Pope's influence on things. The idea of trying to bring a more natural style into the gardens compared to 100 years earlier. Each of those terraces would have ended with some sort of balustrade and a flight of steps down onto the next terrace. And they may have been graveled, and they would have had parterres, sort of raised beds of planting cut into them like keyholes and such. And I think sort of the rise of a more informal sort of English garden style in the early 18th century saved the site from that kind of rigid structure. And it was always intended to look the way it does now.
Well, it's, kind of, it's lovely to be able to understand a bit more, but also to understand that, kind of, it may well have looked similar as well.
Yeah.
I think there's another question about our lovely gardener and the construction of those gravel paths. Kind of, don't you think Henrietta may well have been a little bit upset that the gravel that she had strictly instructed was going to be put on the site was not actually put on? Do you think she would have had a thought about that?
Well, we don't know exactly what was intended in terms of gravel. We know there was a gravel pathway across the front of the house. And we know that there would have been such down the east side where the tarmac currently goes down to the river. We don't know that any of the other paths would have been gravel to start with, and therefore she may not have been upset. He may have been putting down gravel on the bits that were gravel, and she may have been perfectly happy with that. Unfortunately, we just don't have the documentary evidence to back any of that up as to exactly what was or wasn't gravel to start with. So I'm not blaming him for not putting gravel down, but I think that a lot of the paths weren't. I suspect there was a certain amount of understanding that if they were built in gravel to start with, it would cost a lot of money and maintenance would be an issue. And I suspect that Pope may well have said, well, if you just mow this bit as a nice close cropped grass pathway between the slightly more jungly bits either side, it'll do.
Well, I think I would have been a bit annoyed if my gravel wasn't there, but maybe it was indeed spaces that other spaces that she was graveling.
Well, this is it. If it was intended to be there, I could understand her being annoyed, and we may actually have had records of it, because presumably there'd be some sort of action against the gardener. My gut feeling is that large chunks of when we first look at the 1749 plan, we think, well, that ought to be visible, it ought to be gravel. I think it probably never was. And Henrietta Howard never expected it to be. And the gravel was confined to other areas, such as that path across the house. So
it's difficult to know, isn't it?
Well, unless we find gravel paths, yes. Oddly enough, the only gravel path that we found in an area that looked like it should have been a path, in that trench, the zigzag trench 12, where we found the glass house, we did find the edge of a gravel path clipping into the trench a bit further back, which unfortunately was turn of the century, sort of late 19th, early 20th century, based on the material in it. Certainly wasn't an 18th century path, which is a shame.
That is a shame. So it wasn't a late edition or an early edition. That gardener didn't do that one.
No, it was not something that Henrietta would have seen in her lifetime, I'm afraid.
Shucks. We've got one last question that we'll finish tonight's lecture with, and I think it may well have been inspired by The Dig, if you've seen that film.
I haven't seen it yet. I've seen the adverts.
Oh, well, it's a question to you, Thomas. What is the most exciting find that you've ever had?
Oh, I always find these questions really, really difficult. Because the problem is every site has its interesting bits to it. I've never been very good at finding objects, you know, holding up a golden whatever it is and saying eureka. Um, most of my discoveries have been understanding sites, such as figuring out the construction sequence for the Great Tower at Dover Castle, for example, or where we did manage to find the parterres on the terrace at Rest Park, after initially machining off and not seeing anything, and then pushing a bit deeper and eventually finding the evidence of them as they were cut into the natural soils underneath. It's always been things like that that help change the story and our understanding rather than goodies. Other people find goodies, gosh darn it, but I've never been one.
Well, we have been just so delighted to have you at Marble Hill, and we really can't wait for you to come back to explore the grotto. For many of you who know Marble Hill, you'll really see that it has been cut down ready because we need to avoid bird nesting seasons. So it does look a little bit challenging, but it's going to be the great basis for which Thomas to understand a little bit more about that grotto and explore whether there is a second grotto, which is perhaps thought about.
The thorny
Thomas
question.
is less sure, but we'll be finding out more. Of course, these lectures will all be part of the Marble Hill YouTube channel, and they'll be edited and put up within the week. So if you have missed any of Thomas or Judith's talks about the archaeology on site, please do go to the Marble Hill website and Marble Hill YouTube channel, and you can find out a little bit more. And also on that channel will be the Thames Luminaries, which I know a number of you have been a party too. So thank you so much, Thomas, for all you've brought to this evening, and thank you everyone for being part of this lecture. Tomorrow we've got a progress update to give you all a bit of an understanding of what's been going on, as we're sort of about halfway through our project with this amazing lottery funded project that will just be so wonderful for our community. But it's been lovely to be with you all, albeit virtually, and we look forward to being with you again talking about archaeology with Thomas in the summer. Thank you so much. Take care.
Right,
Bye-bye.